Hello. So I'm back. Sorry for I've been away for a couple weeks. We were busy doing field work in Utah and Colorado. So I'm just gonna start. We're back with Rainbow's End. This is the Werner Vinge book and sort of near future augmented reality with the takeover of the library and Robert Gu, who is coming back from his Alzheimer's, and the various intelligence things that are happening as well. So I'm just going to start. So this is called the front bathroom incident. Winston Blount called a couple of times during the next few days. That's Robert Gu's sidekick. They kind of have a contentious relationship. His cabal was very anxious to talk further about what we talked about. Robert put him off and refused to talk privately. He could almost hear Winnie's teeth grinding in frustration, but the guy gave him another week. Robert had several more interviews with the real, well, he could hope it was real, Sharif. They were heartwarming reminders of the good years and totally unlike his encounters with the mysterious stranger. The young grad student gushed semi-intelligent enthusiasm, except that sometimes he seemed fond of science fiction. Sometimes. When Robert mentioned this, Sharif looked stricken. The mysterious stranger strikes again. Or maybe there were three entities animating the image of Zulfikar Sharif. Robert began to track each word, each nuance. Juan Orozco's compositions had blossomed. That's the young guy in high school. He could write complete sentences intentionally. The boys seemed to think that this made Robert Gu a genius of a teacher. Yes, and someday soon there will be chimpanzees who look up to me. But that thought did not escape Robert's lips. Juan Orozco was working to his limits. He was doomed to mediocrity, much as Robert himself, and spreading the pain of such knowledge was not appealing anymore. The mysterious stranger stayed out of sight. Maybe he thought Robert's own need was the best salesman. That bastard. Robert returned again and again to the references the stranger had given him. They described 3 medical miracles of the last 10 months. One was an effective treatment for malaria. That was not such a big deal since cheaper cures had existed for years. But the other 2 breakthroughs related to mood and intellectual disorders. They were not examples of Reed Weber's random heavenly minefield. Both had been commissioned by the customers they cured. So what? Miracles happened in this modern age. What proof was there that the stranger could create them? He pulled up the documents the stranger had given him. Their visual representation was as medieval letters of credit. Envelopes sealed with wax. If one broke the metaphor, it was easy to look inside and see the lower layers, a few megabytes of encryption, useless nonsense. But if you followed the metaphor from the top, then you found pointers to the magic tools to employ the certificates and other pointers to technical papers that explained what these tools actually did with the underlying data. For 3 days now, Robert had been digging through those papers. The old Robert would not have had the intellect for this. God had taken away his true and unique genius and perversely given him this analytical talent in return. Playing with protocols was fun. Okay, another couple of days and he would put it all together and call the stranger's bluff. Meantime, he was falling farther behind in his work with Juan for Chumley's composition class. Will you have time to work on my graphic suggestions? Juan asked one afternoon. Before tomorrow, I mean? That was when their current weekly project was due. Yes, sure. The kid had been great about working to Robert's directions, and he felt a sliver of shame for not reciprocating. I mean, I'll try. I've got this problem with some outside things. Oh, what? Can I help? Lord. Some security documents. They're supposed to prove that a friend of mine was really involved in solving some game problem. He made one of them visible to Juan. The kid looked at the wax and gilt and parchment. Accreditat. I've seen certs like that. Yours has an outer envelope, so only you can do all of the steps. But see, he grabbed the certificate and pointed where Robert should do what. You've got to apply your own stamp first, and then you tear along the server line, and you'll see a release like this. Phantom transformations spread out in the air around him. And if this friend of yours is not blowing smoke, you'll see bright green here, and there will be a written description of his contribution, backed by Microsoft or Bank of America or whoever. Then Juan had to go help his mother. And as he faded away, Robert studied the examples. He recognized some of the steps from the protocol descriptions, but how did you know all of that? Foolish question. The boy looked a little startled. It's just kind of intuitive, you know? I mean, I think that's the way the interface is designed. And then he was completely gone. No one was home right now, so Robert went downstairs and fixed himself a snack. And then he played back the steps the boy had shown him. He had no excuse for further delay. He hesitated a moment more and then applied steps to each of the creditats. Bright green, bright green, bright green. The mysterious stranger didn't like to come visiting when Robert was indoors at home. Maybe the USMC, U.S. Marine Corps, was not as incompetent as the stranger claimed. Robert began to look forward to his time away from home with anticipation and dread. Very soon he must decide. Was betrayal a price he could pay for a chance to be his old self once more? Days passed. Still no contact. The stranger wants me ripe for the picking. And when it finally happened, Robert was walking around the neighborhood doing another interview with Zulfikar Sharif. The young man hesitated in the middle of a question and looked at him. Miri to Juan. I'm locked out. Closed message. Juan to Miri. Again? Closed message. Miri to Juan. Yes, again. Sharif's earnest features took on the sly greenish cast of the mysterious stranger. How's it going, my man? Robert managed a cool response. Well enough. The stranger smiled. You look a bit peaked, Professor. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable sitting down. A car slid to a stop behind them. The door opened and the phantom graciously waved Robert inside. This is more secure, Robert said as they pulled away from the curb. This car is. Remember, I have powers far greater than your little friend's. He settled in the back-facing seat. So, have you convinced yourself that I can help you? Maybe you can, said Robert, a little bit proud of how level his voice sounded. I checked your creditats. You don't seem to know anything about anything, but you do have this knack for bringing the right people together and being around when those people solve serious problems. The stranger waved his hand dismissively. I don't know anything about anything. You are naive, Professor. Our world is overflowing with technical expertise. Knowledge is piled metaphorical light years deep. And given that, the truly golden skill is the one I possess, to bring together the knowledge and the abilities that make solutions. Your Ms. Chumlig understands, though he has one important detail backwards. In me, another elaborate gesture, his hand flattening against his turtleneck shirt. In me, you have the far extreme of this ability. I am world-class at bringing together to get answers. And with an ego to match. Well, how does he get his way when he's dealing with the Einsteins and Hawkings of this era? Surely he doesn't have everyone by the short hairs. The stranger leaned forward. But enough of me. Winnie Blount and his elder cabal are getting desperate. I'm not exactly desperate, but if you delay more than another few days, I cannot guarantee an acceptable outcome. So, are you on board or not? Yes, I am. 20 years ago, betraying Bob would not have bothered him. After all, the idiot was an ingrate. Now, no glib excuse rose to mind, but I'll do anything to recover what I lost. What is this biometric information you want on Alice? Some sonograms we can't take in public, a microgram blood spot. The mysterious stranger pointed at a small box that lay on the seat between them. Take a look. Robert reached down, and his fingers touched something hard and cool. The box was real. That was a first for the mysterious stranger, and he took a closer look. It was gray plastic without any openings or even virtual labels. Wait, there was a ubiquitous no user serviceable parts within. So leave that in your front bathroom this evening, and it will do the rest. I won't do anything to hurt Alice. The stranger laughed. Such paranoia. The point of all of this is to pass unnoticed. Alice Gu is in public places several times a week, and if ill were wished, those would be the opportunities to take advantage of, but you and the cabal, we just need biometrics. Any other questions? No, not just now. Robert slipped the gray plastic box in his pocket. I just can't imagine that 21st century military security can be duped by something as simple as a drop of blood and some sonograms. The stranger laughed. Oh, there's much more to it than that. I mean, Tommy Parker thinks he's covering all the angles, but without my help, you four would not even get into the steam tunnels. He looked at Roger's stiff expression and laughed again. Think of your part as being the user interface. And he gave a little bow. And I am the user. Robert made a point of taking the stranger's gadget through the front hallway bug trap. The small box triggered no alarms that he could see, and so betrayal was as simple as walking into the first floor bathroom and setting the box down among the bags and aerosols and squeeze tubes that were already piled on the side counter. Modern bed and bath products were a bastion of old-style physical advertising. After all, even the most modern folks had to take off their clothes and their contacts somewhere. But Alice and Bob had no style. They brought the cheapest commodity products they could find. The devil box fit right in. Robert took a long shower. It would be nice to feel clean. He heard no strange sounds, saw nothing strange through the frosted glass. But when he came out of the shower, he noticed there was no mysterious gray box either. Even when he pawed around the counter, touching every object there was no sign of an intrusion. The bathroom door had been shut the whole time. Someone knocked on the door, happily following the family rules about not snooping through the bathroom walls. Robert, are you okay? It was Mary. Alice says it's dinner time. Dinner was a nightmare. It was always tense when the four of them ate together. Usually Robert could avoid such get-togethers, but Alice seemed determined to see him with the whole family at least once a week. Robert knew what she was up to. She was recalibrating, deciding if now she could lower the boom on her father-in-law. Tonight she was steelier than ever, and it didn't help that Robert had serious things to hide. Maybe she had some special reason to be suspicious. He noticed that Bob and Mary were doing all the running back and forth to the kitchen. Usually Alice helped with that, and tonight she sat herself down in her usual place and grilled Robert in her merciless, casual way. How was school going? What about the project with Juan? She even asked about his old friends, for God's sake. And Robert explained and smiled and prayed that he was passing the test. The old Robert never had trouble stringing people along. And then Bob and Mary were sitting down to eat, and Alice shifted her attention from her villainous father-in-law. She chatted with Mary in the same friendly, interested tone she had used with Robert. Mary replied with precision, a detailed summary of just who and what was good and bad at school. For a while, Robert almost relaxed. After all, they were here to eat. Surely that couldn't give him away. But something was up, and it wasn't just his imagination. Bob and Alice got into a discussion of San Diego politics, the school bond issue. But there was an edgy undercurrent. Some couples really argue politics, but this was the first time Robert had ever heard that from these two, and every so often Alice's clothes flickered. Around the house in the real world, Alice Gu wore a dumpy housefrau dress that wouldn't have been out of place in the 1950s. When she flickered, it was a virtual imagery, nothing like Carlos's old-fashioned smart t-shirts. And the first time it happened, Robert almost didn't notice, partly because neither Bob nor Mary reacted. And half a minute later, as Alice gestured emphatically about some outstandingly trivial election issue, there was another flicker. For her instant, she was dressed in something like naval whites, but the collar insignia said PHS. PHS? Well, there were lots of different Google hits on that abbreviation, and a minute or two passed, and she was briefly a U.S. Marine Corps full colonel. That Robert had seen before, since it was her true rank. Bob said mildly, "You're emoting, dear." "It doesn't matter," Alice said curtly. "You know that. The point is," and she continued chewing on the school bond issue, but her gaze wandered around the room, eventually riveting on Robert. It was not a friendly gaze, and even though her words were unrelated to Robert Gu, there was a sharpness in her voice. And then, for almost 2 seconds, she was wearing a civilian blue business suit with an old-fashioned ID lanyard, and the ID bore a familiar seal and the letters DHS. Robert knew what that meant. It was all he could do not to flinch back. She can't know everything. He wondered if Alice and Bob were silently coordinating all the scary signs, conspiring to panic him into a confession. Somehow he didn't think Bob was that adept. So Robert just nodded and glanced casually around. Mary had been quieter than usual, and she was staring off into the distance and looked as bored as a 13-year-old can look when she's trapped at home with parents rattling on about things not important. But this was Mary Gu, and this was not the 20th century. Most likely she was surfing through though she usually disguised such absences when she was at the dinner table. Alice slapped the table, and Robert's eyes jerked back to her, and she was glaring at him. Don't you agree, Robert? Even Louise Chumley couldn't glare more aggressively than that. Sorry, my mind was wandering, Alice. And she waved her hand abruptly. It doesn't matter. And then golden letters spread silently across the air. Mary to Robert. Don't worry, she's not mad at you. Closed message. Mary was still gazing into nowhere. Her hands were in plain sight and motionless. She was that good with her clothes. Okay, but what in the hell is going on here? That was the message he wanted to send back. But short of finger tapping, the best he could do was give her a quizzical look. Alice rattled on, interrupted occasionally by Bob, but now Robert was not living in stark terror. He waited another 3 or 4 minutes and then excused himself. Bob looked a little relieved. Well, we don't have to talk so much about the bond issue, Robert. There are other... No, that's okay. I'm the fellow with the homework these days. Robert pasted on a smile and retreated upstairs. He felt Alice's rifled gaze following him every step. If not for Mary's silent language, he would have run up the stairs. And so far, Alice hadn't ventured near the front bathroom. Now, he did have homework. Juan came over and distracted him for almost half an hour with his explanations of immersive outlines. Robert was supposed to have such an outline ready for tomorrow's progress report in Chumley's class. Juan went away pleased. So was Robert. He had made up for several days of an inattention. He fooled around with Juan's templates until he could implement everything. By God, we should be getting an A for cross support. The kid's prose had become almost serviceable, and this immersive he had constructed, well, it was beautiful. He was aware of Mary helping to clean up after dinner and then coming up to her room. Bob and Alice were just sitting in the living room. He set an activity alarm on the first floor, and for a while he forgot himself in the making of more and better refinements to his graphics. Lord, an hour passed. He took a quick glance downstairs. Nobody had been to the front John. There was a pending message from Tommy Parker. The cabal wanted to know if he was going to come through with his contribution. He looked downstairs again. Strange, he couldn't see into the living room anymore. Normally that was on the house menu, but now it was as private as the bedrooms. He stood and walked over to the door quietly, eased it open half an inch, snooping the good old-fashioned way. They were arguing, and Bob was white hot. His voice grew louder and louder, finally breaking into enraged shouting. I don't give a fuck if they do need you. It's always just one more time, but this time you... And Bob hesitated in mid-flame. Robert leaned forward, ear to the door. Nothing. Not even the mumble of circumspect speech. Son and daughter-in-law had taken their spat into ethereal realms. But Robert continued to listen. He could hear the two moving around, and at one point there was the sound of a hand slapping down like a pistol shot, Alice whacking the dinner table. There was half a minute of silence, and then a door slammed. Vision returned a second after that, and Bob was alone in the living room, staring at the door of the ground floor den. He stood there for a few moments, and then circled the living room, and dropped himself down in his favorite chair. He pulled a book off the coffee table. That was one of the 3 physical books downstairs, and even it was a just-in-time fake. Robert Goo quietly shut his bedroom door and returned to his chair, and he thought a moment and then tapped on his virtual keypad. Robert to Mary. What was that all about? Closed message. Mary was 20 feet down the hall, so why didn't he just walk a few feet and knock on the door? Or present virtually? Maybe it was habit of staying out of her way, or maybe it was easier to hide behind words. Maybe he wasn't the only one hiding. It was almost a minute before a reply floated back. Mary to Robert. They're not mad at you. Closed message. Robert to Mary. Okay, but what is the problem? Closed message. Mary to Robert. There is no problem. That's the whole message. But then Mary sent another. Mary to Robert. Alice is getting ready for some new job, and that's always hard on her. And then Bob gets mad. Closed message. There was another pause. Mary to Robert. This is core business, Robert. I'm not supposed to know about it. You're even more not. I'm sorry. EOF. Closed message. EOF, that was space cadet for that's all she wrote. Robert waited. Nothing more came. But this had been more real conversation with Mary than he'd had in 2 months. What did that little girl do with her secrets? They were surely more significant than he had ever guessed. She had better communications facilities than all of the 20th century civilization, but her prissy standards kept her from sharing her pain. Or maybe she has friends she can talk to. Robert Goo didn't have any friends, but he didn't need any tonight. He had plenty of crisis and suspense to distract him. He kept an eye on the front bathroom uh, and another on the door to the den. Bob was still reading, every so often sliding a look of his own at the den. Is now a good time for us to talk, Professor? The voice came from just behind his shoulder. The shock all but levitated Robert from his chair, and he swung on the sound. Jeez. It was Zulfikar Sharif. Sharif backed away, startlement in his face. You could have knocked, Robert said. I did, Professor. Sharif sounded faintly hurt. Yes, yes. Robert still hadn't figured out all the quirks of Epiphany's Circle of Friends feature. He gestured for Sharif to stay. What's on your mind? Sharif did a creditable job of sitting on a chair without sinking halfway through. Well, I was hoping we could just talk. He thought a moment. I mean, we might continue with my questions about your secrets of the ages. Still no action downstairs. Very well, ask. So, who is this? True Sharif? Stranger Sharif? Sci-fi Sharif? Or some ungodly combination? Whatever it was too much coincidence that he showed up just now. Robert sat back to watch and listen. I don't know. Miserably forgetful? But then Sharif abruptly perked up. One thing I'm hoping to get at in my thesis is the balance of worth between the beauty of expression and the beauty of underlying truth. Are they separate? A question to be answered in cryptic depth. Robert paused significantly and then launched into the flim-flam. You should know by now, Zulfi, that even you can't create poetry yourself and that the issues can't be separated. Beauty captures truth. Read my essay in the Carolingian, blah, 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 blah. Sharif nodded earnestly. Then you never expect an end to one and therefore the other, beauty and truth, I mean. Huh? Now, that was sufficiently bizarre to derail him, and Robert parsed and reparsed the stupidity. Will you run out of beauty? And the answer for me is yes, I can't create beauty anymore. So maybe this was just the stranger Sharif jerking him around while they both waited for the little gray box to do its thing. Oh, I suppose there could be an end. And then he thought about the other half of the question. I mean, hell, Sharif, new truth ended long ago. I mean, we artists sit atop a midden 10,000 years deep. The diligent ones of us know everything of significance that's ever been done, and we churn and churn and churn, and some of us do it brilliantly, but it's just a glittering rehash. Did I just say that? And if they're linked, then beauty is gone too? Sharif leaned forward, his elbows on his legs, his chin cupped in his hands. His eyes were large and serious. Robert looked away, and finally he choked out, There's still beauty. I will bring it back. I will regain it. And Sharif smiled, mistaking Robert's assertion for some general faith in humankind in the future. That's wonderful, Professor. This goes beyond your essay in the Carolingian. Indeed. Robert sat back, wondering just what in heaven's name was going on. Sharif hesitated a moment as if uncertain where to go next. So at the UCSD library, I mean, how has your project there progressed? Still no action downstairs, Robert said. You see some connection between my art and the librarian? Well, yes. I mean, I don't want to intrude, but ultimately what you do at UCSD seems to be very much a statement about the position of art and literature in the modern world. Maybe this was sci-fi Sharif trying to figure out what stranger Sharif was up to. If only I could use one against the other. He gave his visitor a judicious nod. I'll talk to my friends about this. Maybe we can arrange something. And that seemed to satisfy whoever it was. They set a time for another chat, and then the visitor was gone. Robert turned off Circle of Friends access. No more surprise visitations tonight. And then downstairs, there was still no action. He watched through the walls for almost 15 minutes. That was certainly a productive use of time. Think about something else, damn it. He blew off the top of the house and looked across West Fallbrook. Unenhanced, this place was very dark, more like an abandoned town than a living suburb. The real San Diego had less sky glow than he remembered from the 1970s. But behind that real view were unending alternatives, all the cyberspace fun Bob's generation could have ever imagined. Hundreds of millions were playing out there tonight. Robert could feel, well, Epiphany could make him feel the thrum of it beckoning. Instead, he tapped out a command Chumley had mentioned. Here and there across North County, tiny lights glowed. Chumley, those were the other students in his classes, at least the ones who were studying tonight and had any interest in what the others were doing. 20 little lights. That was more than 2/3 of the class, a special kind of belief circle, one dedicated to pushing up their cooperation scores as high as possible. He hadn't appreciated how hard these little third raters were working. Robert ghosted all over the suburbs towards the nearest of the lights. He hadn't tried Epiphany's out of body feature before. There was no feeling of air flowing past or motion. It was just his synthetic viewpoint slewing across the landscape. He could still feel his butt on the chair on his bedroom, and yet he understood why the directions said to do this sitting down. The viewpoint swooped down into a valley with a speed that was dizzying. He drifted into a welcoming window, and Juan Orozco and Mahmoud Kwan and a couple of others were gathered in a family room, marking out possibilities for tomorrow's exchange with Cape Town. They looked up and said hi, but Roger could tell they weren't seeing much more than his icon hovering in the room. He could be present virtually, perhaps even look as real as Sharif usually did, but Roger just hung in the air listening to the talk for a few minutes and then, alarm, notification. He cut the connection and was back down in his bedroom. Downstairs, Bob had wandered out of the living room. He stood by Alice's door and knocked gently. As far as Robert could tell, there was no answer, and after a moment, Bob tucked his chin in and turned away. Robert tracked him up the stairs. The sound of footsteps came down the hall, and Bob knocked on Mary's door, the way he did most evenings. And there was mumbled conversation, and Mary's voice saying, "Good night, Daddy." It was the first Robert had heard her call Bob Dad. Bob's footsteps came nearer, and he paused at Robert's door, but he didn't say anything. And Robert watched him through the wall as Bob turned and was swallowed up by the privacy of the master bedroom. Robert hunched over his desk and stared into the downstairs. Alice hardly ever stayed up much beyond Bob, and of course tonight was not your usual night. Damn. You screw up your courage to an act of family betrayal, and then fate dumps problems all over your dishonorable intent. But even if Alice camped out in the den, eventually she'd have to use the bathroom, right? 20 minutes passed. Alice's door opened and she stepped out, turned towards the stairs. "Use the ground floor bathroom, damn you." And she turned again and paced angrily around the living room. Paced? Well, there was a precision and power in every motion, like a dancer or a martial arts nut. Not like a dumpy, frumpy Alice Gongu, she of the mild round face and the shapeless dress. And yet, this was the real view. It was her real face, even if it was tense with pain and drenched in sweat. Huh? Robert tried to follow her gliding dance in close-up. The woman was dripping sweat. Her dress was soaked as if she had just finished a long and frantic run. Like Carlos Rivera. It couldn't be. Alice never got stuck in a foreign language, or in a particular specialty, or in any one particular specialty, but he remembered the web discussion of JITT. What about the few strange people who could train more than once, who became ever more multi-talented until the side effects finally destroyed them? Where would such wretches get stuck if there were dozens of imprints to fall into? Alice's gliding dance slowed and stopped, and she stood for a moment with her head bowed and her shoulders heaving, and then she turned and walked slowly into the front bathroom. Finally! And now I should be overcome with relief, and instead, revelation bounced back and forth in his mind. This explained so many little mysteries. I mean, it contradicted several certainties. Maybe Alice hadn't been gunning for him. Maybe she was no more his enemy than anyone in the house. Some things are not as they seem. It was very quiet. The old house in Palo Alto had little squeaks and thumps, and sometimes Bob's PC playing stolen music. And here tonight, well, yes, there were occasional sounds, the house settling into the cool of the evening. Wait, in the utility view, he saw that one of the water heaters had kicked in. He could hear running water. Not for the first time, Robert wondered what kind of magic that little gray box was. It had not triggered the house watchdogs. Maybe it wasn't electronic at all, but 19th century gears and cogs driven by a metal spring. Then it had disappeared from Robert's own naked eyesight, and that was something new, not a visual trick. Maybe the box had sprouted little legs and scurried off. But whatever it was, what would it finally do? Maybe the stranger didn't need a little blood. Maybe a lot of blood would suit him more. And Robert sat stock still for a second and bolted to his feet and froze again. I was so desperate. Credibility is not important if the victim wants to believe so hard that the truth must be what the liar claims. And so the stranger had mocked the notion that hurting Alice would be worth such a hugger-mugger. And I, desperate, smiled and was convinced. Robert was out of the bathroom and flying down the stairs, and he dashed through the living room and pounded on the bathroom door. Alice, ah! And the door opened, and Alice was looking at him a bit wide-eyed, and he grabbed her arm and dragged her in the hallway. Alice was not a large woman, and she came easily in his grasp, but then she turned, taking him off balance, and somehow his feet got tangled in hers, and he slammed into the door jamb. What is it? She said, sounding irritated. And Robert looked over his shoulder into the brightly lit bathroom and then back at Alice, and she was dressed in a robe now, and her short hair looked as though she had washed it. And everyone is still in place. Everyone is in one piece, and no pools of blood, except maybe where my head hit the door jamb. Are you okay, Robert? Concern seemed to rise above her irritation. Robert felt the back of his head. Yeah, I'm pretty robust these days. And he thought about how he'd come down the stairs, even when he was 17 years old, and he had never skipped 4 steps at a time. But Alice began, and clearly she was more concerned about his mental state than anything else. It's okay, daughter-in-law. I thought I was stopping your murder, and now I find it's a false alarm. Somehow he didn't think that would be a satisfactory explanation. And so why was he down here in the middle of the night pounding on the door? And he looked into the bathroom again. I just needed to use the John. Her sympathy frosted over. Don't let me keep you, Robert. And she turned and headed for the stairs. Are you okay, Alice? Bob's voice from the top of the stairs, and Robert didn't have the courage to look, but he could imagine Mary's little face staring down too, and he stepped into the bathroom and shut the door. He heard his his daughter-in-law's tired voice. Not to worry. It was just Robert. Robert sat on the can for a few minutes and let the shakes die away. Maybe there was still a bomb here, but if it exploded, none but the guilty would be blown apart. And neither did he have the little box. That was the point of the comedy. And when he showed up at the library, he would be empty-handed. So for the moment, Robert stood and looked into the real glass mirror. He favored his reflection with a twisted smile. Maybe he should just bring them a fake. Would Tommy even notice? And as for the mysterious stranger, perhaps his spell had been broken, along with all hope. His eyes strayed to the countertop, and there, sitting away from the clutter, was a small gray box. It hadn't been there when Alice left, and he reached down, and his fingers touched warm plastic. Not an illusion, a greater mystery than all the flash and glitter that he was just becoming accustomed to. He slipped the box into his pocket and quietly returned to his room. So that's the end of chapter 16. And I think this one is not too long, chapter 17. So I'm going to do this one too. Chapter 17 is called Alfred Volunteers. Gunberg Braun and Keiko Mitsuri, they were the top officers in their respective services. Vaz had tracked these two since their college days. He knew more about them than they would ever guess. That was one of the benefits of being very old and very well connected. In a sense, he had guided them into their intel careers, though neither they nor their organization suspected that fact. They weren't traitors to the EU or Japan, but Alfred understood them so well, he could subtly guide them. So he had a thought, and so he still hoped. And yet his two young friends' remorseless efforts to help had become the greatest threat to his plans. As today. Yes, there are risks, Vaz was saying. We knew that from the beginning, but letting a serious you gotta believe me project escape detection would be much more dangerous. We must find out what's going on in the San Diego labs. Plan Rabbit can do that. Keiko Mitsuri shook her head. Alfred, I have contacts in the U.S. intelligence that go back years. Now, these aren't my agents, but they would not tolerate a rogue weapons project. And on that, I would trust them with my life. I say we should contact them very unofficially and see what they can learn about the San Diego labs. Alfred leaned forward. Would you trust them with your country's life? Because that's what we're talking about here. In the worst case, there's not only a you gotta believe me research effort going on in San Diego, but it is supported at the highest levels of the US government. In that case, your friends' best efforts would simply alert their superiors to our suspicions. The evidence would disappear. And when it comes to investigating a threat this serious, we simply must do it ourselves. In one form or another, this was an argument that dated from their Barcelona meeting. Tonight's installment could be decisive. Keiko sat back and gave a frustrated shrug. She was presenting more or less her real appearance and location. A 30-year-old woman sitting on her desk somewhere in Tokyo. She had transformed one side of Vaz's office with her minimalist furniture and a picture window view of Tokyo's skyline. Gunberg Braun was less prepossessing. His image simply occupied one of Alfred's office chairs. No doubt Gunberg figured that the EU swung enough weight that he could afford a mild disposition. Gunberg might be the real problem today, but so far he was just listening. Okay, Alfred spreads his hands. I truly think the course we set in Barcelona is the most prudent one. Can you deny the progress we have made? And he waved at the biographical reports scattered around the table. We have hands and minds on the scene, all deniable and ignorant of what is manipulating them. In fact, they totally misunderstand the significance of the operation. Do you doubt this? Do you think that the Americans have any whiff of our investigation? Both youngsters shook their heads. Keiko even gave him a rueful smile. No, your SHE-based compartmentalization is truly a revolution in military affairs. Indeed, and our releasing those methods, even to sister services within the Alliance, shows how seriously we at the EIA view the current necessities. So please, if we delay more than 100 hours, we might as well start over. So what is your problem with giving the final go-ahead? Gunberg glanced at his Japanese counterpart. She made an impatient gesture for him to go ahead. I assume your question is rhetorical, Alfred. The problem with Plan Rabbit is Rabbit. Everything depends on him, and still we know almost nothing about him. And neither will the Americans. Deniability is the whole point. Rabbit is everything we could want. He is more, Alfred. Gunberg's gaze was steady. For all his youth, Braun had a solid aspect, a turn-of-the-century German. He moved from point slowly, inexorably. In setting up this operation, Rabbit has performed miracles on your behalf. His ability demonstrates that he himself is a threat. Vaz glanced at the results of Gunberg's latest investigation. But you have discovered critical weaknesses in Rabbit. However much he's tried to disguise it, you've traced all his certificate authority to a single apex. Having a single CA apex was not unusual. That Gunberg had managed to discover Rabbit's apex was a triumph. For Alfred, given his own sensitive relationship with Rabbit, it was miraculously good news. Gunberg nodded. Credit Suisse. So what? So, if Rabbit turns out to be a nightmare, you could pull the plug on Credit Suisse and put him out of business. Pull the plug on Credit Suisse, CA. Do you have any idea what that would do to the European economy? I am proud of my people that they ferreted the secret out, but it's not something we can effectively use. Well, we should have dropped Rabbit after that first meeting in Barcelona, said Keiko. He is too clever. Vaz raised a hand. Well, perhaps, but how could we know? Yeah. Forgive me, Alfred, but we wonder if you know more about Mr. Rabbit than we. Damn. Not at all, honestly. Alfred leaned back in his chair and took in the nervous postures of his colleagues. You've been talking behind my back, haven't you? He gave them a gentle smile. Do you think Rabbit is really American intelligence? Chinese? They had spent a lot of time investigating those possibilities, but now Keiko shook her head. Then what is your theory, my friends? Well, said Gunberg, sounding a little embarrassed, maybe Mr. Rabbit is not even human. Maybe it's an artificial intelligence. Vaz laughed. He glanced at Keiko Matsuri. And you? I think AI is a possibility we should consider. Rabbit's talents are so broad, his work is so effective, and his personality so juvenile. That last one was one of the features US DARPA thought would be characteristic. She saw the incredulity on Vaz's face. Not every threat is a cult or a conspiracy. Of course, but AI monsters? That's a bogeyman of the 20th century. I mean, who in the intelligence communities takes that seriously? That's Pascal Heriot's hobby horse, isn't it? And Alfred's tone became low and serious. Have you been talking to Pascal about this project? Of course not, but AI is a threat that's been totally overlooked in recent years. Correct, because nothing has ever come of it. Before the Sino-American War, we know DARPA spent billions on the Little Helper project, and it was almost as much as a fiasco as their space access denial initiative. Well, space denial worked. Voss laughed. Well, it worked against everybody, Keiko, the Americans most of all, but you're right. SAD is not a proper comparison. My point is that some of the smartest people in the world tried to create AI and failed. The researchers failed, but surely runnable code survived. The internet is not the cramped toy it once was. Maybe pieces of DARPA's Little Helper are out there growing into what we could never be in the low-tech past. Well, that is science fiction. There was even a movie, more than one actually, said Gunberg. Alfred, I don't agree with Keiko that programs from years ago could self-organize just because decent resources are available now, but here at the IB, we have been tracking the possibilities, and I think Pascal Heriot has a point. Just because most people have dismissed the possibility doesn't mean that it's not real. We are certainly past the crossover point when it comes to computer hardware. Pascal thinks that when it finally happens, it will arise without institutional precursors. It will be like many research developments, but rather more catastrophic. Just another way humankind might fail to survive the century. Well, whatever the explanation, said Keiko, Rabbit is simply too competent, too anonymous. I'm sorry, Alfred. I think this operation should be shut down. Let's approach our American friends on this. She shrugged. With Rabbit managing things, well, that could leave Rabbit with whatever we discover in San Diego, and even if we agreed with you, our bosses would never go along. She was serious, and Alfred glanced at Braun, and he was too. This was bad. Keiko, Gunberg, please, let's just balance the risks. We are, said Keiko. Rabbit loose within this grandiose scheme is a cosmic size unsafety. She could be quite full of modern Japanese bluntness. Vaz said, but we could arrange things so Rabbit receives operational information just in time as the action evolves. Fortunately, Gunberg shot that down immediately. Ah, no, such remote micromanagement is a guarantee of disaster. Vaz hesitated a long moment and tried to look as though he were thinking hard, making some hard decision. Maybe there's a way we can have everything. Those grandiose scheme and minimal risk from Rabbit. Well, perhaps we don't supply Rabbit with the final details in advance. Suppose we put one of our own people on the ground in Southern California the night of the break-in. Mitsuri and Braun stared for a second. But what about deniability then, said Keiko, if we have our own agent breaking in? Think, Keiko, my proposal risks tipping off the Americans, which is something yours guarantees. And we can keep the risk low. We simply put our own agent nearby in a well-planned position with essentially zero latencies, what the Americans call a local honcho. Gunberg brightened. Like Alice Gong at Ciudad General Ortiz? Yes, exactly. He hadn't been thinking of Alice, but Gunberg was right. It had been Alice Gong on the ice at Ortiz, almost single-handedly discovering and stopping the free waterfront. Maybe the front would have failed anyway, and after all, no one had ever tried to scale a Saturday night special up to 300 megatons. But if the bomb had successfully detonated, their statement of principle would have poisoned the freshwater mining industry off West Antarctica. Gong remained unknown to the outside world, but she was something of a legend within the intelligence communities. She was one of the good guys. Well, thank goodness neither Braun nor Mitsuri seemed to notice Alfred's discomfort at her name. Inserting a honcho now would be difficult, said Keiko. Are we talking a credible tourist or cargo container roulette? Truly black insertions seemed like a WMD smuggling. They were hair-raising operations for all concerned. None of my agents in place are rated for this operation. It will take a special person, special talents, special clearance. Well, I have some good people in California, said Gunberg, but none of them are at this level. It doesn't matter, said Vaz, his voice filled with steely determination. I'm quite willing to go myself. He had surprised them before, but this was a bombshell. Braun sat for a moment, open-mouthed. Alfred, it's that important, Vaz said, and he gave them each his most direct and sincere look. But you're a desk jockey like us. Alfred shook his head. Today they would have to let a little bit of his background story come unglued. Hopefully it wouldn't all tear apart. Alfred had spent years fitting in as a mid-level bureaucrat at the ex internal intelligence agency. And if he were unmasked, then at best he'd end up looking like a prime minister forced back into a high-level political hackery. At worst, Gunberg and Keiko might figure out what he was really up to in San Diego. Vaz to EIA Inner Office. Clear biographical package 3 for joint intelligence viewing. Closed message. Aloud, he said, I do have field experience in the US, in fact, in the early teens. Braun and Mitsuri both had a long stare. They were busy browsing Biopack 3, which showed them the operations. It was all consistent with what they had known before, but revealed now depths to their Indian pal. Gunberg was the first to recover. I see. He was silent for a moment, reading more. Well, you did well, but that was some years ago, Alfred. This will be a heavily networked technical assignment. Alfred nodded at the criticism. True, I am not a young man. Mitsuri and Braun thought he was in his early 50s. On the other hand, my specialty here at the EIA is network issues, so I'm not really out of date. A surprised grin flashed across Keiko's face. And you do know this operation better than anyone, so by being on site, you can supply the critical pieces without giving them to Rabbit. Correct. Well, Gunberg was still unhappy. And yet, this is an extraordinarily dangerous operation. We great powers compete, that is true, but when it comes to the threat of weapons, we must stand together. This is the first time in my career that a covenant has been broken. Alfred nodded solemnly. We must find out the truth, Gunberg. We could be wrong about San Diego, and then we'll thankfully and silently disengage. But whatever the source of this weapon, we must discover it. And if that turns out to be San Diego, the Americans will very likely thank us. Mitsuri and Braun looked at each other for a long moment, and finally they nodded, and Keiko said, We'll support the insertion of a local honcho, presumably you. And I will put planners on fallback strategies in case you are exposed. And we will provide network and analyst support. And it will be up to you to manage critical data on the ground. And keep Mr. Rabbit from taking over the whole thing, said Gunberg. Alfred sat in his office for some minutes after his friends departed. That had been too close a thing. When the stakes are highest, the threats always multiply. Plan Rabbit was the most sensitive operation that the Indian government had ever, knowingly, been part of. Getting the Prime Minister's support had not been easy, and Tegay, Keiko, and Gunberg had almost shut him down as thoroughly as the Prime Minister could have. And as for Rabbit, well, AI might be a fantasy, but Rabbit was just as much a threat as Gunberg and Keiko feared. Alfred relaxed slightly, allowing himself to smile. And yet the threats had multiplied like, well, rabbits. But here today he had collided some of those threats and neutralized them. And for weeks he had been plotting his local honcho role. And in the end, Gunberg and Keiko had provided him with the natural excuse to be present on the ground in San Diego. And that's the end of chapter 17. So right now we are about 206. We're a little more than halfway through. So apologies for the delay over the past 2 weeks while I was away, but glad to be back. I'll still try to do this couple times a week and keep it going. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll have this added to the playlist for the other chapters in case you're just catching up. And also just to recommend, while we were in Utah and Colorado, we did about 30 plus site visits to various places connected with the cyborg avatar capitalist scheme. And those are on a playlist too. So check those out, and we'll be adding more. Jason will be adding more as we go along. So good night, everybody.